Jeffrey, it's
Yeah,
Jeffrey. Thanks for joining us.
glad to be here. Glad to be here.
Excellent. Last Friday, obviously the 51st anniversary of the murder of Fred Hampton. For listeners, viewers who may not know, Fred Hampton was the chairman of the Illinois chapter of the Black Panthers. He was also deputy chairman of the national chapter. And on December 4th, 1969, there was a pre-dawn raid, and he was killed. Now, that 3 hours later, you were in a jail holding cell with his grieving fiance, who was telling you, because she was 9 months pregnant, she witnessed what took place. For those who may not know, could you paint a sort of a portrait of Fred Hampton, who he was, and why the FBI and authorities targeted him?
Yes, Fred Hampton was a tremendously dynamic young leader. He grew up in the working class suburbs of Chicago. His parents had actually come up in the Great Migration from Louisiana. Um, and Fred grew up in Maywood, Illinois. And early on, he just had a sense of justice. When he was 10 years old, he invited the neighborhood kids over for breakfast on Saturday morning. He started his own breakfast for children program because some of them didn't have very much food at home. When he got to high school, he was leading protests because black girls were not being considered for homecoming queens and because there were not enough black teachers or black administrators. As his father told me, he said there was something about Fred, he just couldn't accept injustice anywhere. He also had a speech defect early on, and so he practiced speaking. He learned the cadence from the minister that at the church his parents went to. He also memorized some of the speeches of Dr. King and Malcolm X. So that even by the time he was in late high school, he was recognized as a leader. He was made the head of the NAACP Chicago suburban chapter in Chicago, and it grew from like 30 to 300 people in the 11 months that he was head of it. And then he was being recognized. Stokely Carmichael was speaking in Chicago, and Fred introduced him. And Stokely said, "Well, who is this guy?" So that a few months later, when Bobby Rush, who was part of SNCC, went out to the West Coast and they decided to start a Panther chapter in Chicago, they made Fred the deputy chairman of the chapter. And the chapter opened and the Panthers started in Chicago in November of 1968. And immediately they were a lot of young people went there, young college students, people from the street, all kinds of folks were drawn to the Panthers a lot because of their stand-up position. They were demanding their rights, not asking for their rights. They started a breakfast program in Chicago, which started in one place, and there were 6 or 7 of them by the time a year later. Very popular program. And as Fred said, I don't know, some of these mothers may not agree on socialism, but they sure like the breakfast program. But Fred was just this tremendous speaker and organizer. And I think one of the reasons he was so effective was not just he was telling people what to do, go to the breakfast program at 6 a.m., sell your quarter of papers, but Fred was always doing those things himself. So he wasn't the kind of leader that said, well, you go out and do it and I'll tell you what to do. And he just galvanized people. And one of the early things that they did, the Panthers, they created this Rainbow Coalition with the Young Lords, which was a Puerto Rican. It started as a Puerto Rican gang and then fought gentrification in Lincoln Park. And the Young Lords became political, and so did the group called the Young Patriots, which was a group of Appalachian whites, most of whom had recently immigrated from West Virginia or Kentucky. And they had some common issues in poor housing, poor schools, and police brutality. And so Fred helped with them form the Rainbow Coalition, the first Rainbow Coalition before Jesse Jackson did later. And the Panthers, of course, also were very much a target. They had very heavy rhetoric about the police and the right of self-defense. The Panther office was raided twice by the police and once by the FBI. And Fred was on the police radar very much. When there was a heist of 71 bars of ice cream from an ice cream truck across the street from where Fred lived, and he went out afterward, they identified him and charged him not only with theft, but with armed robbery or with robbery. And he was convicted of that. He wouldn't have normally, that would have been a probation, but the very ambitious prosecutor actually told the judge, and he ended up with a sentence of 2 to 5 years in the Illinois prisons. And he went down Menard Prison in March of 1969 to begin serving his sentence. I was one of a group of lawyers that started the People's Law Office in Chicago. Partly we started because Fred said, we need lawyers to represent us, the Panthers, and SDS was in Chicago, and the Young Lords, and the anti-war movement. There'd been a lot of action in Chicago. You had the Democratic Convention in 68. Dr. King had come there in 67. So it seemed very much like the center of a world revolution that was going on everywhere. And people were very much out in the streets. And when Fred came out of jail in the summer of 1969, he gave this famous speech. And my partner, Flint Taylor, and I were there. And I'll just read you a little bit of that speech to give you an idea of how dynamic Fred Hampton was. And so Flint and I had just taken a seat in the church. I think there weren't a lot of white people there, but it was packed. And there were a few of us there, a few of SDS people and so forth. So my colleague Flint Taylor and I found an opening in a row about halfway back. After a few minutes, things quieted down. There was a hush. A moment later, Fred emerged from the side and strode to the pulpit. Everyone stood up and clapped. The wall shook with the thunder of 300 voices chanting, "Free Fred Hampton." Unlike at other Panther events, Fred was not surrounded by Panthers in leather jackets and black berets. He stood alone, dressed in a button-down shirt with a pullover sweater. Fred Hampton held a microphone in his right hand and looked at the crowd. "I'm free," he began, then repeated it. People shouted their approval. "I went down to the prison in Menard thinking we were the vanguard. But down there, I got down on my knees and listened and learned from the people. I went down to the valley and picked up the beat of the people." A drum beat started and everyone clapped to the rhythm. Fred chanted, a cross between a Baptist preacher and Sly and the Family Stone. "I'm high," making each high into a 2-syllable word. I'm high off the people. And then he said the words again. Yeah.
Hey, Jeff. Yeah. So we really appreciate that background because I think, the life of Fred Hampton's always is often obscured, obviously, and people to this day are still confused about just his role in this country. I just want to ask you, just because the limited time we have, can you just give our viewers an idea of what happened at that pre-dawn raid on the day he was murdered, and sort of your role in exposing that?
Okay. At that speech, he said, "I'm not going to die slipping on a piece of ice of a heart attack," and predicted what would happen to him, which did happen 3 months later. So someone knocked on my back door, and my law partner said, "There's been a raid this morning at 4:30. This was 6 a.m., and the chairman's been killed. The pigs vamped on his apartment." So I went to the police station and asked, where the survivors of the raid. And as I went there, I heard that 2 people, Fred and Mark Clark, were killed. 5 people were injured, and there were 3 survivors at the police station who had not been shot. So I went there and interviewed Deborah Johnson, who was Fred's fiance. And I went into the interview room, and she came out still in her nightgown, obviously pregnant at that time. And she was crying and shaking. And she says, so I said, "What happened?" And she said, "Well, they knocked and then they came in shooting. They didn't announce." And I was in the bedroom with Fred, and I got on Fred. When the bullets kept coming, I actually got on top of Fred, but he never really woke up. And then the police pulled me out of that room, and I heard 2 police go in. And one of them said, "Is he dead yet?" And I heard 2 shots. And then the other one said, he's good and dead now. And as we learned later, the photograph showed they dragged Fred Hampton out into the hallway like a trophy. The police did. And the police were putting out these lies that the Panthers had opened fire on them. But we went to the apartment, we interviewed the survivors, and we found that it was a shoot-in, not a shootout. And so all the bullets except one came from the police, and that was a reflexive shot up into the ceiling after somebody had been hit. So this was a shoot-in. What we later discovered was not only was Hanrahan, the prosecutor, and the police involved, but it was set up by COINTELPRO, the government program, whose objective was to disrupt, destroy, and neutralize the Panthers. We learned that there was an informant, an FBI informant who was in the Panthers, who had actually given them a floor plan showing not only the apartment, but the furniture in the bed where Hampton and Johnson would be sleeping. And so that floor plan went to the FBI, it went to the police who did the raid, and the trajectory of the bullets was towards the bed where Fred and Deborah were sleeping.
It's absolutely, I mean, you can't even, absolutely incredible investigative work you guys did. Again, Fred Hampton, 21 years old, rising in the Black Panthers, incredibly charismatic, gifted speaker, had that power, as you said, Jeffrey, to unify and unite. He started the Rainbow Coalition, pre-dawn raid. They already have his bodyguard was an informant that they flipped. They executed him, as you said, and you found out from the fiance. He was sleeping. He was drugged. They dragged the body out. Then they then their whole story was a big shootout. As you said, your investigation, you guys traced the bullet holes. You guys went there. It was a big sham. And you mentioned COINTELPRO, and I would just love to play. We did an episode on COINTELPRO. Fred Hampton was obviously one of the targets. J. Edgar Hoover was, had feared of this rise of this, quote, Black Messiah. He went after Malcolm X, MLK, the list goes on of the activists. We'd like to play this clip for you and then come back and ask you one last question about it. I think you're going to enjoy it.
You hoodoo, my guru, traba, matulu, traba, Zulu, Nesferatu, gotta do slews, and he summoned you for high noon. You getting high and mighty with your haikus, highs and bites becoming highlighted with who's who. Now they zoomed in on your new tunes. We got your finances, books you reading, publication, education, social media is subjugated. They got Alexa and Siri calling with information. Once you out of line, they on the line. You online and that's double time. The Patriot Act nullified. Any right you thought you had is vilified. Once you on the list, church out, it's dinner time. You just another docket. Got you boxed in, a pine box or 3 hots in a cot. Either way you locked in. They kill both men John, same way they killed Fred Hampton. Only difference how they planned it. Word up.
COINTELPRO never went away, ever. Certainly after 9/11, everybody should be aware that the national security state went into high gear. This is a country that spies and is not ashamed on its own allies, on the heads of state of Germany, on the head of Brazil, on its friends in high places. Well, what do you think they are doing in terms of spying on the folks that they think are organizing dissent among the most despised people in the United States, Black America? COINTELPRO never went out of business. When this BIE nomenclature came up, it simply reminded us that the COINTELPRO-like programs never die, but they do change nomenclature. They change their bureaucratic identities, but it's always the same. This country has had, in effect, a counterinsurgency program to which many billions of dollars is committed, certainly ever since the late 60s. The mass incarceration regime that was put into effect was the United States answer to the Black liberation movement of the 60s. If you don't stay in your place, we've got a place for you, and that is prison. And that's why almost 1 out of every 8 prisoners in the world is an African American.
And that of course was Glenn Ford, the acclaimed journalist, talking about COINTELPRO and how it and it's sort of its legacy. Speaking of legacies, Jeff, can you just in the 2-3 minutes that we have left, can you talk about Fred Hampton's legacy, especially as we deal with the racial reckoning that we're going through right now in this country and how that relates?
Well, I think in many ways the Black Lives Matter have raised the issue of the Panthers and Fred Hampton, and the fact that some of their demands for land, for freedom, for not having, for against mass incarceration, not have to serve in foreign wars, just basic liberation things have been echoed in what the movement is talking about today. But also, of course, the repression that came down on the Panthers and different ways of dealing with that. And it's interesting that the Black Lives Matter movement today has much more, it doesn't have single hierarchical leadership, some way the way the Panthers do. As they say, they're leaderful, not leaderless. But I think Fred and what he stood for and the need for revolution in this country is it hasn't been as clear since the 60s as it been this summer. And I think that's why what he said and the power of his words and the power of his life and his commitment. He said, if you're not willing to make a commitment at the age of 21 because you're afraid to die, well, then you're dead already. And I think that kind of message is really resonating today. And of course, as your clip showed, COINTELPRO has many different names. I was an attorney up at Standing Rock, and they've added private security firms like Tiger Swan that actually work with the pipelines to do counterintelligence, as well as, of course, the government, the drones, these also these towers that they put up that can tell what not only who's everybody within 50 miles, but what's in your backpack. All these sophisticated methods. So we're up against a lot, but also there's a lot of awareness now, and I think the contradictions are as clear now as they were in the 60s.
Jeffrey, we thank you so much for joining us. We thank you for the work that you do on a daily basis, and we recommend. I mean, we consider Jeffrey's book, "The Assassination of Fred Hampton: How the FBI and the Chicago Police Murdered a Black Panther." We consider that essential reading. We recommend it to everyone listening, everyone watching. And Jeffrey, we look forward to speaking with you again.
All right. Enjoy being on the show. Thank you very much. Keep up the good work.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. Take care.
Okay.
Wow.
Well.
I mean,
Thank you, Jeff.